In 1964, racial segregation still ruled the South by both law and custom. And Lyndon Johnson was a Southerner, burdened by a history of vacillation, compromise, and a long string of votes that had kept segregation strong. Civil rights would measure the limits of Lyndon Johnson's moral imagination.
A Southern accent went a long way to raise my defenses. So when Johnson became president, I was fearful. I was very, very unhappy.
With civil rights activists confronting segregation all across the South, many Americans wondered how the new president would react.
Johnson did not approve of, he did not like. I can even use a stronger term. He hated the demonstrations of the movement in the streets. He hated them.
But he had enough sensitivity that he knew that all hell was going to break loose if we didn't do something about it.
Civil rights workers lay siege to a segregated society. There were sit-ins at lunch counters, on trains and buses, in hotels and theaters, forcing Johnson to act. When some of Johnson's aides advised him not to lay the prestige of the presidency on the line, he responded, "What's it for if it's not to be laid on the line?"
He said over and over and over again in those days, "I'm going to be the president who finishes what Lincoln began." Said it over and over again. Well, it was great rhetoric, but you also knew that it was a great reading of history, that if, in fact, he could accomplish that, he'd have belonged up there on Mount Rushmore.
A bill to prohibit the segregation of blacks and whites in public facilities had been put before Congress by John Kennedy, but it was stalled. Johnson determined to act.
This bill is going to pass if it takes us all summer. And this bill is going to be signed and enacted into law because justice and morality demand it.
All of a sudden, there was a power and a force behind this kind of legislation that we hadn't seen in the Kennedy time. And with that, my view about him began to change.
The full force of the Johnson treatment, perfected in the Senate, now became a weapon in the arsenal of the presidency.
He was on the phone with Republican senators and with Southern Democrats. And he was bargaining with them. He was telling them about some bridge that they wanted back home or some dam that they wanted. And he would help them with that if they would help him with this and give him this thing that he wanted, that the whole nation wanted and the nation had to have. And he was also reminding them in not too subtle tones that if they didn't support him, he would have ways of getting back at them.
So in those days, we played hardball. My catalog included a number of Southern congressmen where you had to say, he'd say, well, now, Jack, there's no way I can vote for that. And I'd say, well, Mr. Congressman, now, I know you've got this, this, and this that you want, and I don't think we're prepared to deal with you on that unless you're going to be responding to some of the entreaties from the president. We let him know that for every negative vote, there would be a price to pay.
And he kept saying to his Southern friends, if I can advocate it as president, you ought to be able to vote for it in your constituency. This may be the best chance we'll ever have. I think we've got to change the way of doing things. It's not like a Yankee from New York saying, we got to do this. This was a Southerner saying it ought to be done. And that helped. It didn't help a whole lot because the Southern boys, they knew that they're going to catch heck for it.
That's what he got from the Southerners, that you're killing us by loving up the niggers. You're ripping the party apart. You're hurting us. And Johnson's answer was, this is what we've got to do, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is what the Democratic Party is supposed to do.
Once again, the leader of the Southern Democrats, his old friend and mentor, Richard Russell, stood in his way.
Of course, but we are not yet ready to surrender in our opposition to this bill, which we feel is a perversion of the American way of life.
And he said to Dick Russell, I want this civil rights bill passed, and you nor no one else is going to stand in my way. And I remember Richard Russell said to him, well, Mr. President, yeah, you may do it, but I'll tell you what, it's going to cost you the South, and it will cost you an election.
Southern senators prepared to filibuster, to prevent the bill from ever coming to a vote by talking it to death. But Johnson was not to be denied.
What the president did was to say, they can filibuster till hell freezes over. I'm not going to put anything else on that floor, so the filibuster couldn't win. And that was Johnson's great contribution to the Civil Rights Bill.
The debate paralyzed the Senate for 83 days. It was the longest filibuster in Senate history. And then the Senate voted to stop the talking. The bill passed. That same evening at 2 in the morning, Johnson reached Congressman Jake Pickle, one of only 6 Southerners to vote in its favor.
And he said, now, Jake, he says, this is your president. He said, I know it's late, and I know where you've been. I said, where have I been? He said, you've been out having a few drinks and trying to vote, trying to forget that vote you cast. You voted for the civil rights, and you're trying to forget it. And I said, I sure have been. He said, because you're going to catch heck, aren't you? And I said, yes, sir, I'm afraid I will. He said, well, let me tell you, the reason I'm keep calling is I want you to know that your president is extremely proud of you. He said, I had chances to do something like that when you was congressman. He said, I didn't. And he said, I've always regretted. He said, you did something I thought was basically right, and I didn't want this night to go by until I called and you personally to tell you how proud I am of you. He said, I am. Now he said, go to sleep. Of course, I could, between the vote and that call, it was hard to go to sleep in.
I remember that when I was in the White House talking with him, I asked him how he got to be the way he was. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, here you are calling senators, twisting their arms, threatening them, cajoling them, trying to line up votes with the Civil Rights Bill, when your own record on civil rights was not a good one before you became vice president. So what accounted for the change? Johnson thought for a moment and wrinkled his brow, and then he said, well, I'll answer that by quoting a good friend of yours, and you will recognize the quote instantly. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Civil Rights Act of 1964.
When Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill into law, a century of enforced segregation was finally over. Blacks and whites could ride the same buses, eat at the same restaurants, use the same washrooms, stay at the same hotels. A Southern president had broken the Southern system of segregation.
There was something about this man. I mean, he had a pretty shoddy career, and he'd done some pretty ruthless and awful things. But he knew poverty, and he knew racism. And I really think that he decided that this was the way to assure his place in history. This was the way to really save the nation. And he knew it was not politically expedient, but I think he really knew it was right.
His attitude going in was that Kennedy couldn't pass anything. I will pass everything that Kennedy failed to do. Where Kennedy failed, I will succeed. I am Kennedy's trustee. I will out-Kennedy Kennedy. I will perform what Kennedy promised, period.